I thought my morning would be calm and quiet. You're alone at your peaceful seaside cabin, sipping tea at sunrise, when suddenly the security alarm blares on. Your daughter-in-law shows up with movers, claiming she owns your home. What would you do? Trust me, you won't believe what happened next. There are few things in life as precious as a quiet morning by the sea, especially when you've reached the age where you've earned every single one of those peaceful moments. That morning, I was wrapped in my favorite old robe, the one with the faded blue stripes and the pocket that always seems to have a forgotten tissue in it, sitting on the porch of my little seaside cabin. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, and the only thing on my mind was whether I should indulge in a second scone. I'd baked them the night before, and the smell of butter and currants still lingered in the air, mixing with the salty tang of the ocean breeze. It was the kind of morning that makes you sigh with contentment and think, this is what it's all about. I'd just poured myself a fresh cup of Earl Grey, the steam curling up in lazy spirals, when the world decided to remind me that peace is always temporary. Out of nowhere, beep, beep, beep. The security alarm went off, shattering the calm like a rock through a stained glass window. I nearly spilled my tea, heart thumping in my chest. The alarm was loud enough to wake the dead, and I could only imagine what the seagulls thought of the racket. For a split second, I wondered if I'd left a window open or if a particularly bold raccoon had decided to try its luck with my kitchen. Before I could even set my cup down, my phone rang. The screen flashed security gate, and I answered, bracing myself for whatever nonsense was about to come my way. On the other end was Frank, the night guard. Frank is a sweet man, but not exactly the picture of composure. His voice was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, and I could hear the alarm still blaring in the background. "Ma'am," he stammered, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but your daughter-in-law is here, with movers. She says she owns the place." For a moment, I just sat there, blinking at the phone. My daughter-in-law, at 5 a.m, with movers. I glanced at the clock, just to be sure I wasn't dreaming. Nope, 5:03 a.m. on the dot. I took a deep breath, trying to process what Frank had just said. Tiffany, my son's wife, was many things, but an early riser was not one of them. And as far as I knew, she didn't own so much as a doormat on this property, let alone the whole cabin. Now, let me ask you, what would you do in that situation? Hide under the bed, call your lawyer, or maybe just pretend you weren't home, and hope the problem would go away. I'll admit, for a split second, the idea of crawling back under my quilt and letting Frank handle it was tempting. But then I remembered who I was. I'm not the type to run from a little drama, especially not before breakfast. So I took a long, slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth and the bergamot, and said, "Let her in, Frank. Let her in. She's about to get a surprise." I could almost hear the relief in his voice as he mumbled, "Yes, ma'am," and hung up. I set my cup down, straightened my robe, and took a moment to look at myself in the window's reflection. Hair a mess, slippers on, but eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and mischief. If Tiffany thought she could waltz in here and take over my sanctuary, she was in for a rude awakening. As I waited, I couldn't help but let my mind wander. What on earth was she thinking? Had she misunderstood something in the will? Was this some elaborate prank? Or had she finally lost her mind after one too many yoga retreats? I chuckled to myself, imagining her standing at the gate in her designer tracksuit, clipboard in hand, barking orders at a couple of sleepy movers who'd probably been promised a quick job and a big tip. The minutes ticked by, and I could hear the distant rumble of a moving truck making its way up the gravel drive. I took another spoon, why not, at this point, and nibbled on it as I watched the scene unfold from my porch. The movers, two burly men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, were unloading boxes and glancing nervously at Tiffany, who was gesturing wildly and checking her phone every few seconds. I had to admit there was a certain thrill in the air, a little fear. A little excitement, like the first time you ride a roller coaster after swearing you're too old for such nonsense. My heart was pounding, but not from panic. No, this was the kind of adrenaline rush that comes from knowing. You're about to turn the tables as Tiffany marched up the path, her heels clicking against the flagstones. I stood up and smoothed my robe, ready to greet her with all the grace and poise of a woman who's seen it all. I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she realized she'd underestimated me. After all, this was my cabin, my sanctuary. And I wasn't about to let anyone, family or not, take it from me without a fight. And so, with the sun rising higher and the waves crashing in the distance, I prepared myself for whatever was about to come through that door. One thing was certain. This was going to be a morning to remember. If you've never seen a woman on a mission at 5 in the morning, let me paint you a picture. There was Tiffany, my daughter-in-law, strutting up the path to my beloved seaside cabin as if she were about to close a deal on Wall Street. Her heels sharp, shiny, and at least 4 inches hike, licked against. The flagstones with the kind of authority that could make a grown man apologize for existing. Behind her, 2 movers trudged along, each lugging a box and wearing the universal expression of men who'd been promised. Just a quick job, and we're now questioning every life choice that led them to this moment. The sun was barely up, the air still tinged with that early morning chill. But Tiffany looked as fresh as a daisy, albeit a daisy with a very expensive blowout, and a folder clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. I watched from my porch, mug of tea in hand, as she approached. I couldn't help but marvel at her determination. Say what you will about Tiffany, but the girl knows how to make an entrance. She had that look in her eye, the one that says, I mean business, and, if I'm being honest, a little bit of, I dare you to stop me. I'd seen that look before. Usually when she was negotiating with a waiter over a wine list or trying to return a handbag she'd already used for a month. But this was different. This was personal. Good morning, Tiffany, I called out, waving with a kind of casual cheeriness that only comes from years of practice. Moving in already. Hope you brought your own towels. I just washed mine, and you know how I feel about sharing. She didn't miss a beat. Tiffany flashed a smile so cold it could curdle milk. Her lips painted a shade of red that probably had a name like Hostile Takeover. Actually, I have the deed, she announced, holding up the folder like it was the Holy Grail. I'm the new owner. Now, I know what you're thinking. Did I forget to pay the mortgage? Did I accidentally sign something after too much Chardonnay at last year's 4th of July barbecue? Trust me, I ran through all those possibilities in my head too. But no, I hadn't lost my marbles. I knew exactly what was going on. And as I watched Tiffany plant herself at the foot of my porch, I had to fight the urge to laugh. Because, dear friends, I had a little secret up my sleeve. The movers, sensing the tension, hovered awkwardly by the truck, boxes in hand. One of them gave me a sympathetic look, as if to say, Sorry, lady, we just work here. Tiffany, meanwhile, was already halfway up the steps, folder at the ready. She stopped just short of the top, probably to avoid getting sand on her shoes, and fixed me with a look that would have made a lesser woman wilt. I'm sure this is a surprise, she said, her voice syrupy sweet, but I have all the paperwork right here. The cabin is mine now. I thought it would be best to get the moving over with quickly, before the season really starts. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Well, that's certainly efficient of you, Tiffany. But I always thought you preferred the city. The ocean air can be a bit bracing. She bristled, but pressed on. I've always loved this place. And now that it's mine, I plan to make a few changes. Maybe open up the kitchen, add a hot tub, get rid of some of these antiques. She glanced pointedly at my grandmother's old rocking chair, which I'd dragged out onto the porch for the morning. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The idea of Tiffany, who once called a handyman because her dishwasher looked at her funny. Overseeing a renovation was almost too much, but I let her have her moment. After all, she was so sure of herself, so certain that she'd finally outmaneuvered me. I almost felt bad for what was coming next. Almost the movers. Sensing that the coast was clear, started up the steps with the first of the boxes. Tiffany turned to direct them, her voice crisp and commanding. "That goes in the master bedroom. And be careful with the crystal, please. It's very expensive." I watched the whole production with a kind of detached amusement, like a spectator at a play I'd already seen a dozen times. Tiffany was in her element, orchestrating the chaos, convinced that she was finally getting what she wanted. But as I watched her, I couldn't help but wonder what was really driving her. Was it just the cabin? Or was it something more? A need to prove herself, maybe, or to carve out a space that was truly hers. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. She was about to get a lesson in reading the fine print. I let her talk, let her direct the movers, let her bask in her moment of triumph. All the while, I sipped my tea and waited. Because sometimes, the best way to win is to let your opponent think they've already won. As the sun climbed higher and the boxes piled up in the entryway, I felt a strange mix of emotions: amusement, anticipation, and, if I'm honest, a little bit of pride. Tiffany was nothing if not determined. But she was about to learn that in this family, the real power doesn't come from a piece of paper or a fancy folder. It comes from knowing when to play your cards and when to keep your secrets close. And as I watched her take charge of my cabin, couldn't help but smile, because the real show was just about to begin. Tiffany swept into the cabin with all the confidence of a woman who believed the world was finally bending to her will. She didn't even pause to take in the view, the one that had sold me on this place all those years ago, with its endless blue horizon and the gentle hush of the waves. No, she was too busy barking orders at the movers, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but caught in the crossfire of a family drama before sunrise. "Put the boxes in the master bedroom and be careful with my crystal," she snapped, her voice echoing off the old wooden beams. The poor men exchanged glances, one of them nearly tripping over the threshold as he tried to maneuver a box labeled fragile past the antique hall table. I followed her inside, cradling my mug of tea like a shield, and leaned against the doorframe watching the show unfold. There was something almost theatrical about it. Tiffany, in her designer suit and killer heels, directing the chaos as if she were the star of her own reality show. I had to give her credit. She was nothing if not determined. But as I watched her, I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. She was so sure of herself, so certain that she'd finally outmaneuvered me. Only she knew what was coming. She turned to me, folder in hand, and gave me a look that was equal parts triumph and exasperation. "You know, you might want to start packing up your things," she said, her tone just a shade too smug. "I'd like to get the place redecorated before the end of the month. Maybe open up the kitchen, get rid of some of these old knickknacks. It's time for a fresh start." I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle me. "You know, Tiffany, you might want to check the date on that deed," I said, my voice as casual as if we were discussing the weather. She rolled her eyes, clearly convinced I was just being difficult. "It's right here," she said, waving the folder in my direction. "Signed, sealed, delivered." I had my lawyer look it over twice. There's no mistake. Couldn't help but smile. Signed? Yes. But delivered? Not quite. I set my mug down on the hall table and reached for my own folder, which I'd tucked away in the drawer for just such an occasion. You see, the cabin was transferred to a trust last year. And guess who the trustee is? For a moment, Tiffany just stared at me, her confidence faltering. The movers, sensing a shift in the air, froze in place, boxes in hand, as if waiting for the next act in a play they didn't quite understand. I opened my folder and pulled out the paperwork, holding it up for her to see. "Me," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "And the trust says you can visit in weekends. It's with permission, and only if you bring pie." The silence that followed was almost comical. Tiffany blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what I'd just said. The movers looked from her to me and back again, clearly unsure whose orders they should be following. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered all the times she'd tried to steamroll her way through family gatherings, all the little digs and power plays. This was a lesson she needed to learn. She snatched the deed from her folder and scanned it, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. "This can't be right," she muttered, her voice losing some of its edge. My lawyer said I cut her off with a gentle smile. "Your lawyer didn't have the full picture. The trust was set up last year, after your last, let's call it an enthusiastic attempt to redecorate the lake house. I wanted to make sure this place stayed in the family, but also that it stayed the way it's always been, a place for peace, not power struggles." Tiffany's face went through a whole range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a grudging respect. She looked at the paperwork in my hand, then back at her own, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves in her favor. But the truth was right there in black and white. The cabin belonged to the trust, and I was the one holding the keys. The movers, sensing that their services might no longer be required, began edging toward the door, boxes still in hand. One of them cleared his throat. Ma'am, should we?" Tiffany waved them off, her shoulders slumping just a little. "Just wait outside for a minute," she said, her voice softer now. The men nodded and slipped out, leaving us alone in the entryway, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the lingering scent of my morning scones. For a long moment, Tiffany just stood there, staring at the paperwork. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization dawning that she'd been outmaneuvered. I almost reached out to comfort her, but I knew she needed a moment to process it all. Instead, I picked up my mug and took another sip of tea, letting the silence settle between us. Finally, she looked up at me, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" I shrugged, trying to keep the mood light. "Let's just say I've learned a thing or two over the years. And besides, I couldn't let you get rid of Grandma's rocking chair. It's got more history than half the family put together." She laughed, the tension breaking at last. "I guess I should have known better than to try and outsmart you." I grinned, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "Next time, just bring the pie. It's a lot less paperwork." The look on her face, priceless. Almost felt bad. But as the morning sun streamed through the windows and the sound of the waves drifted in, I knew I'd done the right thing. Some places and some traditions are worth protecting, no matter what. For a long moment after the big reveal, the only sound in the cabin was the distant crash of the waves and the soft clink of my spoon against my teacup. Tiffany stood there, her folder drooping in her hand, her carefully constructed plans unraveling before her eyes. I braced myself for a storm terror's accusations, maybe even a dramatic exit. But then, to my utter surprise, Tiffany did something I never would have expected. She laughed. Not a bitter or sarcastic laugh, but a genuine belly-deep chuckle that seemed to shake off all the tension in the room. "You got me, Mom," she said, shaking her head, her eyes sparkling with a mix of defeat and admiration. "I guess I should have read the fine print. I walked right into that one, didn't I?" I couldn't help but join in, the two of us standing there in the middle of the chaos, giggling like a couple of schoolgirls caught sneaking cookies before dinner. The movers, sensing that the drama had passed, quietly retreated to the truck, leaving the boxes stacked neatly by the door. For the first time all morning, the cabin felt peaceful again. The kind of peace that comes not from solitude, but from the relief of a storm weathered together. "Come on," I said, gesturing toward the porch. "Let's have some tea. I think we both need it." Tiffany followed me outside, her heels clicking a little less confidently now, but her shoulders relaxed. I poured her a cup, added a splash of milk the way she liked, and pushed the plate of scones her way. She took one, broke it in half, and sighed. "You know, I really thought I had you this time," she admitted, a rueful smile on her lips. "I spent weeks planning this. I even had a Pinterest board for the new curtains." I grinned, taking a sip of my own tea. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. But you know, Tiffany, you don't have to stage a coup to be part of this place. You're family. You always have been." The words came out softer than I intended, but I meant them. Maybe I hadn't always shown it, but I wanted her to know. She looked out at the ocean, her expression thoughtful. I guess I just wanted to feel like I belonged. Like I had a stake in something real. My family moved around so much when I was a kid. I never really had a place that felt like home. When I married your son, I thought maybe this could be it. But I didn't know how to ask. So I tried to take it instead. Her honesty caught me off guard. I'd always seen Tiffany as a force of nature, confident, ambitious, sometimes a little too much for her own good. But sitting there in the morning light, I saw a different side of her. Vulnerable, hopeful, and maybe just a little bit lost. I reached over and squeezed her hand. You don't have to take anything, sweetheart. All you have to do is show up. And maybe bring a pie now and then, I added with a wink. Trying to lighten the mood, she laughed again, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. Deal, but only if you teach me how to make those scones. Mine always turn out like hockey pucks. We sat there for a while, sipping tea and swapping stories. She told me about her childhood summers spent in cramped apartments, about her dreams of having a place where everyone felt welcome. I told her about the first time I saw the cabin. How I'd fallen in love with the sound of the waves and the way the light danced on the water at sunset. We talked about family, about the silly arguments and the moments that mattered. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized that maybe I'd been holding on a little too tightly, not just to the cabin, but to the idea that it was mine alone. Maybe it was time to let someone else in to share the sunrise and the scones and the stories that made this place special. As the sun climbed higher, movers reappeared, looking sheepish. Tiffany waved them over and, with a newfound sense of calm, directed them to leave the boxes on the porch. We'll sort it out later, she said, glancing at me for approval. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of pride. She was learning, and so was I before she left. Tiffany turned to me, her eyes serious. Thank you, Mom, for everything. I know I can be a bit much sometimes, but I really do want to be part of this family. I promise. No more surprise takeovers. Just tea and pie from now on. I hugged her, holding her a little longer than usual. That's all I ever wanted, Tiffany. Just you being you. As her car disappeared down the drive, I sat back on the porch, the ocean breeze ruffling my hair. I thought about everything that had happened, the alarm, the movers, the showdown in the hallway, and I couldn't help but smile. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Sometimes it takes a little drama to remind us what really matters. So what's the moral here? Always read the fine print. Never underestimate a woman with a seaside cabin or a daughter-in-law with a Pinterest board. And if your DIL shows up at 5 a.m. with movers, make sure you have enough tea for everyone. Because in the end, it's not about who owns the deed or who picked out the curtains. It's about family, laughter, and the stories we share along the way. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of family, friendship, and a little bit of seaside mischief. After all, you never know what surprises tomorrow's sunrise might bring.